The dust clouds kicked up by the old pickup truck were visible from miles away across the vast Montana landscape. Jake Morrison set down his coffee mug on the porch railing and squinted against the afternoon sun, watching the unfamiliar vehicle make its way down the long gravel road that led to Cedar Ranch. In his 15 years of running the sprawling cattle operation he'd inherited from his father, unexpected visitors were rare. The nearest town was 43 miles away, and folks didn't just happen to drive by. The truck pulled to a stop near the main house, its engine sputtering before falling silent. Jake remained on the porch, his weathered hands resting on the wooden railing as he observed the driver. A woman emerged from the vehicle, her movements careful and deliberate. She was tall and slender, wearing a long brown coat despite the warm September weather, and a colorful shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders and upper arms. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and even from a distance, Jake could see the exhaustion etched in her posture. She stood by her truck for a long moment, surveying the ranch with eyes that seemed to take in every detail. The red barn with its weathered paint, the sprawling pastures where Angus cattle grazed peacefully, the neat rows of fence posts stretching toward the horizon, and finally, the two-story farmhouse where Jake stood watching her. When their eyes met across the yard, she lifted her hand in a tentative wave. Jake descended the porch steps, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. Up close, he could see that she was probably in her early 30s, with striking green eyes and a face that would have been beautiful if not for the shadows of weariness that seemed to cling to her features. There was something guarded about the way she held herself, as if she was ready to retreat at the first sign of trouble. "Afternoon," Jake said, touching the brim of his worn Stetson. "Can I help you with something?" The woman's smile was hesitant but genuine. "I hope so. My name is Sarah Chen. I'm looking for work, and I heard in town that ranches sometimes need extra hands for the season." Jake studied her carefully. She didn't look like the typical ranch hand who showed up looking for work. Her clothes were clean but worn, and there was an educated quality to her speech that suggested she'd seen more of the world than most folks who ended up in rural Montana. But there was also something desperate in her eyes, a need that went beyond simple employment. "What kind of experience do you have with cattle?" he asked. Sarah's hands tightened on the edges of her shawl. "I grew up on my grandfather's farm in Oregon. I know how to handle livestock, mend fences, operate basic farm equipment. I'm a quick learner, and I'm not afraid of hard work." There was truth in her words, Jake could tell, but also something she wasn't saying. He glanced at her truck, noting the out-of-state plates, and the way everything she owned seemed to be packed into the vehicle's bed, covered by a blue tarp. "You running from something?" he asked directly. In his experience, people who showed up at remote ranches with all their belongings usually were. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm running towards something better," she replied. "Everyone deserves a fresh start, don't they?" Jake nodded slowly. He'd been raised to help folks in need, and there was something about this woman that stirred his protective instincts. She reminded him of the injured animals he sometimes found on his property, wary and hurt, but not broken. "I can offer you work," he said. "Room and board plus wages. There's a small cabin about half a mile from here that the previous ranch hand used. It's not much, but it's clean and private." Relief washed over Sarah's features so completely that Jake felt a tightness in his chest. Whatever she was dealing with, she'd been carrying it alone for a long time. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what this means to me." "We'll start you off with general ranch duties," Jake explained as he led her toward the main house. "Feeding the livestock, checking fences, helping with the cattle when we move them between pastures. The work starts early and ends late, especially during roundup season." Sarah nodded eagerly. "I understand. I appreciate any opportunity you're willing to give me." As they walked, Jake found himself stealing glances at his new employee. The shawl she wore was beautiful, intricate patterns in deep blues and golds that suggested it held special meaning. But she kept it pulled tight around her shoulders, even in the warm afternoon air. Her movements were graceful but careful, as if she was constantly aware of how much space she occupied and how visible she was to others. "Where are you from originally?" Jake asked as they reached the porch. "California," Sarah answered after a slight hesitation. But I've been traveling for a while now. Jake sensed there was more to that story, but he didn't push. Everyone had a right to their privacy, and he respected that. He'd learned over the years that people shared what they needed to when they were ready. His housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, appeared at the front door as they approached. Elena Rodriguez had worked for the Morrison family for over 20 years and had an uncanny ability to sense when something important was happening. She was a motherly woman in her 60s with graying hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. "Elena, this is Sarah Chen. She's going to be helping out around the ranch," Jake explained. Elena's smile was warm and welcoming. "Wonderful. Are you hungry, dear? I was just preparing dinner." "Oh, I don't want to impose," Sarah began, but Elena waved away her protests. "Nonsense. Anyone who works on this ranch eats at this table. It's one of Jake's rules," Jake chuckled. "Actually, it's one of Elena's rules. But I agree with it." Over dinner, Sarah gradually began to relax, though she kept her shawl draped over her shoulders throughout the meal. Elena's homemade enchiladas and warm conversation created an atmosphere that was hard to resist, and Jake found himself learning small details about his new employee. She was well-read, with opinions on everything from sustainable farming practices to the latest best-selling novels. She had a quick wit and a gentle laugh that transformed her face completely. But beneath the surface pleasantness, Jake sensed layers of complexity. Sometimes, Sarah's eyes would grow distant, as if she was remembering something painful. Other times, she would catch herself saying too much and retreat back into polite but guarded responses. After dinner, Jake drove Sarah to the small cabin that would be her new home. The one-room structure was simple but comfortable, with a kitchenette, a sitting area with a wood-burning stove, and a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder. The previous occupant had left it spotlessly clean. "The bathroom is just out back," Jake explained, showing her around. "It's not fancy, but it's private. There's a generator for electricity, and the well water is good. If you need anything, the main house is just down that path." Sarah explored the space with obvious pleasure, running her fingers along the handmade quilt on the bed and examining the small collection of books left behind on the shelf. "It's perfect," she said. "Thank you, Jake. Really. Work starts at 5:30 tomorrow morning," he told her. "I'll come by around 5:15 to show you where everything is." As he turned to leave, Sarah called out to him. "Jake, why did you decide to hire me? You don't really know anything about me." Jake paused in the doorway, considering her question. "Sometimes you have to trust your instincts about people," he said finally. "Mine tell me you're someone who deserves a chance." That night, as Jake sat on his porch listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening, he found himself thinking about his new employee. There was a mystery surrounding Sarah Chen, something in her past that had brought her to his remote corner of Montana, the way she held herself, the careful way she spoke about her travels, the shawl she wore like armor. All of it suggested someone who had been through something difficult. Jake had his own experience with people trying to start over. His younger sister had shown up at the ranch 3 years earlier, fleeing an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back. He'd learned then that sometimes the best thing you could do for someone was give them space to heal and work to keep their hands busy. Meanwhile, in the small cabin, Sarah sat by the window looking out at the star-filled Montana sky. For the first time in months, she felt something resembling peace. The constant knot of anxiety in her stomach had loosened slightly, and the hypervigilance that had become second nature was beginning to fade. She touched the edges of her shawl, feeling the familiar texture of the wool that had become her constant companion. Underneath the beautiful fabric lay the reason she'd been running for so long. The reason she couldn't simply go home or ask family for help. The scars that crisscrossed her shoulders and upper arms told a story she wasn't ready to share with anyone, especially not with a kind man who'd offered her refuge. But for tonight, at least, she was safe. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the chance Jake had given her. She would work harder than any ranch hand he'd ever employed. She would show him that his trust hadn't been misplaced. As she prepared for bed, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life here. among the rolling hills and endless sky of Cedar Ranch. The past would always be with her, written on her skin in raised pink lines and faded bruises. But perhaps the future could be different. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost glittering on the grass and the promise of a beautiful autumn day. Jake knocked softly on Sarah's door at exactly 5:15, and she emerged ready for work, dressed in jeans, boots, and a long-sleeved shirt with her shawl securely in place. "Ready to become a ranch hand?" Jake asked with a grin. Sarah smiled back, and for a moment, the shadows in her eyes receded. "More ready than you know," she replied. As they walked toward the barn in the pre-dawn darkness, neither of them could have predicted how completely their lives were about to change, or how the truth that Sarah carried beneath her shawl would transform not just her own future, but Jake's as well. 3 weeks passed like a blur of early mornings and honest work. Sarah proved herself to be everything she'd claimed, and more. She had an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that impressed even Jake's most experienced hands, and her willingness to tackle any job, no matter how difficult or unpleasant, quickly earned the respect of everyone on the ranch. But it was the small things that caught Jake's attention. The way she always wore long sleeves, even when the afternoon sun made everyone else strip down to t-shirts. How she would disappear into her cabin immediately after dinner, instead of joining the other ranch hands for evening conversations around the fire pit. The careful way she moved, as if certain positions or sudden movements caused her discomfort. Most telling of all was the shawl. It had become as much a part of Sarah's appearance as her dark ponytail or worn work boots. She wore it while working, while eating, while sitting on her cabin's small porch in the evenings. Jake had never seen her without it, and he'd begun to wonder what she was hiding underneath. The revelation came on a Tuesday evening in early October. The ranch had been bustling with activity as they prepared for the autumn cattle drive, moving the herd from the summer pastures to winter grounds closer to the main buildings. It had been a long, dusty day, and everyone was tired, but satisfied with the progress they'd made. Sarah had volunteered to stay late to help Jake repair a section of fence that had been damaged when a spooked bull had charged through it. They worked in comfortable silence as the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and pink that took Sarah's breath away every evening. "Hand me that wire cutter," Jake said, indicating the tool that lay just out of his reach. Sarah stretched to grab it, leaning across a wooden post to reach the tool. As she did, her shawl caught on a protruding nail. The fabric pulled tight, and before she could react, the shawl was yanked from her shoulders. The wire cutter fell from her hands as she spun around, desperately trying to retrieve her covering. But it was too late. Jake had seen. The scars were everywhere. Thin white lines crisscrossed her shoulders and upper arms like a roadmap of pain. Some were clearly old, faded to silver threads against her skin. Others were more recent, still pink and raised. There were burn marks, too. Circular scars that could only have come from cigarettes, and darker marks that suggested bruises that had been allowed to heal and then renewed again and again. Jake stood frozen, the fence post forgotten in his hand. Sarah's arms were wrapped protectively around herself as she struggled to untangle her shawl from the nail, tears streaming down her face. "Don't look," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't look." But Jake couldn't stop looking. Not because of morbid curiosity, but because he was finally understanding the depth of what Sarah had survived. The careful way she moved, the long sleeves, the constant vigilance. It all made terrible sense now. "Sarah," he said gently, setting down his tools and moving toward her. "No," she said, backing away from him. "This is why I can't stay anywhere. This is why people can't know. I'm damaged goods, Jake. I'm not the person you thought I was. You're exactly the person I thought you were," Jake replied firmly. "You're brave and strong, and you've survived something that would have broken most people." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Strong? I let someone do this to me for 3 years. I stayed because I was too scared and too stupid to leave. That's not strength. That's weakness." Jake felt anger rise in his chest, but not at Sarah. At whoever had hurt her so badly, so systematically. At a system that had failed to protect her, at the circumstances that had made her believe she deserved such treatment. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sarah had finally managed to free her shawl and was wrapping it around herself like armor once again. "My husband," she said simply. "Ex-husband now. Marcus Chen." The name hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd heard that name before, seen it in newspapers. Marcus Chen was a successful businessman in California, known for his charitable contributions and community involvement. He had a reputation as a pillar of society, a man who supported women's shelters and spoke out against domestic violence. "Marcus Chen from San Francisco?" Jake asked. "The tech entrepreneur?" Sarah's face went white. "You know him?" "I know of him. He's been in the news. Didn't he just receive some kind of humanitarian award?" The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled her shawl tighter. "He's very good at managing his public image. In private, he's a monster." Jake felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "That's why you can't go to the police. Who would believe you against someone with his reputation and resources?" "I tried," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "I went to the police twice. The first time, Marcus convinced them it was a misunderstanding, that I was mentally unstable, and had hurt myself. He had his lawyer there within an hour, and suddenly I was the one being questioned about my mental health history." She sat down heavily on a nearby fence post, looking exhausted by the weight of her memories. "The second time, I had photographs of the injuries, but Marcus had documentation that I'd been seeing a psychiatrist for depression, and his lawyer argued that I was self-harming and trying to frame my husband. When you have enough money and influence, you can make any story believable." Jake sat beside her, careful to maintain some distance so she wouldn't feel trapped. "What made you finally leave?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with pain. "He started talking about children, about how he wanted to start a family, and I realized that if I stayed, if I brought a child into that house..." She shook her head. "I couldn't let him hurt anyone else, so I waited until he went on a business trip, packed what I could carry, and left." "How long ago was that?" 8 months. I've been moving ever since, working odd jobs, staying just long enough to save some money before moving on. I can't use my real name or my credentials because he has people looking for me. Private investigators, lawyers. He doesn't want me back because he loves me. He wants me back because I'm his property, and no one takes his property without consequences." Jake felt a surge of protective anger unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "He's not going to find you here." Sarah's smile was sad. "He'll find me eventually. He always does. Someone recognizes me, or I make a mistake and use a credit card, or I stay in one place too long. The longest I've managed to stay anywhere was 6 weeks. You've been here 3 weeks already. I know. I should leave soon, before I put you and Elena and everyone else at risk." "Like hell you will," Jake said firmly. "This is Montana, not California. Out here we protect our own, and you're one of ours now." Sarah looked at him with something that might have been hope. "You don't understand what you're saying. Marcus has connections, resources. He could make trouble for your ranch, for your business. I've seen what he can do to people who help me." "Then we'll be ready for him," Jake replied. "I've got 23 ranch hands, most of whom are military veterans who know how to handle themselves. I've got a sheriff who's been a friend of my family for 30 years. And I've got something Marcus Chen doesn't have." "What's that?" "Right on my side." For the first time since her shawl had fallen away, Sarah's smile reached her eyes. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Every word." They sat in comfortable silence as the last of the sunset faded into darkness. Sarah had stopped trying to hide her arms, and Jake could see the full extent of what she'd endured. Some of the scars were clearly defensive wounds, places where she'd tried to protect herself. Others were more deliberate, placed with an intent to cause maximum pain and humiliation. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually. "Anything. When you look at me now, what do you see?" Jake considered the question carefully. "I see a woman who survived hell and came out fighting. I see someone who's been broken but refused to stay broken. I see the strongest person I've ever met. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't about not being afraid, Jake said. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are afraid. You left a situation that was killing you. You've been taking care of yourself for 8 months with no help from anyone. You came to a strange place and proved yourself through hard work and determination. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks. I've never told anyone the whole truth before. About what really happened, I mean. I'm honored that you trusted me with it. They walked back toward the main house in comfortable silence. Elena was waiting on the porch, her motherly instincts having apparently sensed that something significant had occurred. She took one look at Sarah's tear-stained face and opened her arms. "Mija," she said softly, and Sarah collapsed into the older woman's embrace. Over dinner, Sarah told Elena her story. The housekeeper listened without judgment, occasionally making comforting sounds or patting Sarah's hand. When the tale was finished, Elena was quiet for a long moment. "My first husband was like that," she said finally. "Not as rich or powerful, but just as cruel. I stayed for 15 years because I thought it was what wives were supposed to do. When he finally went too far and put me in the hospital, my sister came and took me away. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, leaving, but it was also the best thing." Sarah stared at the older woman in surprise. "You never said anything. Everyone has their secrets, dear, but sometimes sharing them makes them less powerful." Elena reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You're safe here. Jake won't let anything happen to you, and neither will I." That night, Sarah sat by her cabin window without her shawl for the first time in months. The scars on her arms were visible in the lamplight, but somehow, they seemed less shameful now. They were part of her story, proof of what she'd survived. She thought about Jake's reaction, how he'd looked at her scars with sadness but not disgust, with anger at what had been done to her but not judgment of her for enduring it. For so long, she'd believed that anyone who saw the physical evidence of her abuse would see her as damaged, used, worthless. But Jake had seen something different entirely. Meanwhile, in the main house, Jake was making phone calls. The first was to his lawyer, a sharp-minded woman who'd helped him navigate the legal complexities of running a large ranch operation. The second was to his friend Sheriff Tom Bradley, a no-nonsense lawman who'd grown up in these parts and understood that sometimes justice required more than just following the letter of the law. By morning, Jake had a plan. It wasn't a perfect plan, and it carried risks. But it was a start. A way to ensure that Sarah could stop running and start living. Because in the space of 3 weeks, this wounded, guarded woman had become important to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The next few days brought changes to the rhythm of ranch life. Sarah continued to work, but now there was an openness to her that hadn't been there before. She laughed more readily, spoke more freely about her opinions and experiences. The constant tension that had marked her movements began to ease. Jake found himself watching her work with new appreciation. Seeing her scars hadn't diminished his respect for her. It had multiplied it. Every task she performed, every challenge she met with quiet determination, took on new meaning when he considered what she'd overcome to be standing there. But even as Sarah began to relax into her new life, both of them knew that the peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. Marcus Chen's reach was long, and his resources were vast. Sooner or later, he would track down his missing wife. The question was whether they would be ready for him when he came. The confrontation came on a cold November morning, 6 weeks after Sarah's shawl had fallen away and changed everything between them. Jake was in the barn checking on a mare who was due to foal any day when Elena burst through the doors, her face pale with worry. "Jake, there are strangers coming up the road," she said breathlessly. "Expensive cars, city people." Sarah saw them from the pasture and ran straight to her cabin. Jake felt his stomach drop. They'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it as much as possible. But facing the reality was different from planning for it. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Sheriff Bradley, then called out to his ranch hands. "Tommy, get on the radio and tell everyone to come back to the main compound. Code yellow." It was the signal they'd established weeks ago, when Jake had explained the situation to his most trusted employees. By the time the convoy of black SUVs reached the main house, Jake was waiting on the porch, with 6 of his most experienced hands flanking him. Elena had positioned herself strategically by the front door, and Sheriff Bradley's patrol car was visible coming down the road from the opposite direction. The lead SUV stopped 20 feet from the porch, and Marcus Chen emerged from the passenger side. He was exactly what Jake had expected. Tall, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit that looked absurd in the rural setting, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from never having been told no. He was followed by 2 men who were clearly private security, and a woman in a business suit who had lawyer written all over her. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I'm looking for my wife, Sarah Chen. I believe she's been working here." "Don't know anyone by that name," Jake replied evenly. "You're welcome to check with the county employment office if you're looking for someone." Marcus's smile never wavered, but Jake caught the flash of irritation in his eyes. "Please, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I know she's here. I have very reliable information." "From who?" Sheriff Bradley asked as he approached the group, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Because I'd be interested to know who's been tracking people in my county without proper authorization." The lawyer stepped forward. "Sheriff, I'm Margaret Walsh, Mr. Chen's legal counsel. We're not tracking anyone. Mr. Chen has simply been searching for his missing wife, who left their home without warning 8 months ago. The family is concerned about her mental health." "Funny thing about mental health," Jake said. "Seems to improve dramatically when people get away from what's causing them stress." Marcus's facade cracked slightly. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it? I've done my research on you. Small-time rancher, struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments on this place. I imagine a substantial financial contribution to your operation would be welcome." "Are you attempting to bribe a peace officer and a private citizen?" Sheriff Bradley asked mildly. "Because that's a felony in the state of Montana." "I'm simply trying to resolve a family matter," Marcus replied smoothly. "My wife is clearly not well. She's been making wild accusations, fabricating stories. I just want to get her the help she needs." "What kind of help?" Jake asked. "The kind that leaves scars?" For the first time, Marcus's composure slipped completely. His face hardened, and the mask of concerned husband fell away to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "Careful, Mr. Morrison. You're interfering in matters you don't understand. I have significant resources and influential friends. I could make life very difficult for you." "Is that a threat?" Sheriff Bradley stepped closer, his casual demeanor shifting to something more official. "It's a statement of fact," Marcus replied. "I want my wife back. She belongs with me. Nobody belongs to anybody else," a quiet voice said from behind them. Everyone turned to see Sarah walking toward them from the direction of the barn. She'd been hiding, but something, perhaps the sound of Marcus claiming ownership of her, had brought her out. She wore her usual work clothes and her shawl, but there was a new quality to her bearing, a strength that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived at the ranch. Marcus's face lit up with what might have looked like relief to someone who didn't know the truth. "Sarah, darling, thank God you're safe. When you left without a word, I was so worried. We all were." "Were you worried when you put out those cigarettes on my arms?" Sarah asked calmly. "Or when you locked me in the basement for 3 days because I spoke to the mailman?" "Sarah, please. You know your medication sometimes makes you confused. Dr. Reeves has been very concerned about these delusions." "Dr. Reeves, who you paid to diagnose me with conditions I don't have?" Sarah interrupted. "The same Dr. Reeves who prescribed medications I didn't need so I'd be easier to control?" The lawyer moved closer to Marcus, whispering urgently in his ear. Sheriff Bradley was taking notes, and Jake could see several of his ranch hands positioning themselves strategically around the vehicles. "I think you should leave," Jake said firmly. "The lady has made her position clear." "The lady is my wife," Marcus snapped, his careful composure finally cracking completely. "And she's coming home with me, whether she wants to or not." "Actually, she's not your wife anymore," Sheriff Bradley said pleasantly. The divorce papers were filed yesterday in Helena. Properly served and everything. Marcus's face went white, then red. You can't do that. The prenuptial agreement clearly states. The prenuptial agreement is void, Jake said. Contracts signed under duress aren't legally binding, especially when there's documented evidence of the coercion. What evidence? Marcus demanded. Sarah slowly unwrapped her shawl, letting it fall to the ground. The scars on her arms were clearly visible in the morning sunlight, and she turned slightly so everyone could see the full extent of what had been done to her. This evidence, she said quietly. One of the private security men actually took a step backward. The lawyer's face went pale. Even Marcus seemed stunned by the visual impact of Sarah's injuries displayed so openly. I have photographs of all of them, Sarah continued. Detailed medical records from 3 different doctors who examined me. Testimony from neighbors who heard me screaming. And I have this. She pulled out a small digital recorder. 3 years' worth of recordings, Marcus. Every threat, every time you described exactly what you were going to do to me. Every time you explained why I deserved it. Amazing what people will say when they think their victim is too terrified to ever fight back. Marcus lunged toward her, but found himself facing 6 angry ranch hands and a sheriff with his weapon drawn. You little... I'd be very careful what you say next, Sheriff Bradley warned. Because anything you say can and will be used against you. You're under arrest, Mr. Chen. On what charges? The lawyer demanded. Domestic violence, assault, battery, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and that's just to start with, Bradley replied as he reached for his handcuffs. I imagine the district attorney will think of a few more once he reviews the evidence. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his carefully constructed world crashing down around him, he looked back at Sarah with pure hatred. This isn't over, he snarled. Yes, it is, Sarah replied firmly. I'm not your victim anymore, Marcus. I'm a survivor. And survivors fight back. The vehicles pulled away, taking Marcus Chen and his enablers back toward whatever justice awaited them. Sarah stood watching until they disappeared completely, then slowly picked up her shawl from the ground. You don't have to wear that anymore, Jake said gently. Not if you don't want to. Sarah looked down at the beautiful fabric that had been both her protection and her prison for so many months. I think I'll keep it, she said thoughtfully. But not to hide anymore. To remember. Remember what? That I survived. That I'm stronger than I knew. That there are good people in the world who will stand up for what's right. Over the following weeks, as the legal proceedings began, and Marcus Chen's carefully constructed public image crumbled under the weight of evidence and testimony, Sarah began to truly heal. The physical scars would always be there, but the emotional wounds started to close. She kept working on the ranch, but now it was because she chose to, not because she was hiding. Jake offered her a permanent position as assistant ranch manager. Recognizing the leadership skills and intelligence she'd been forced to suppress for so long. I've been thinking, Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant colors. About names. What about them? Sarah Chen isn't really who I am anymore. She was Marcus's victim, his property. But Sarah. She paused, considering. Sarah Morrison has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Jake nearly choked on his coffee. Are you proposing to me? Sarah laughed. The sound lighter and more genuine than anything Jake had heard from her before. Maybe I am. Unless you think it's too soon. I think, Jake said carefully, that I fell in love with a woman who was brave enough to survive hell and strong enough to build a new life from nothing. Whether her name is Chen or Morrison or anything else doesn't change that. Is that a yes? That's a definitely yes. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony on the ranch, surrounded by the people who had become Sarah's chosen family. Elena cried through the entire service. Sheriff Bradley gave Sarah away, having become something of a father figure to her during the legal proceedings. The ranch hands formed an honor guard as the couple walked down an aisle lined with wildflowers. Sarah wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to accommodate the scars on her arms. She'd decided not to hide them anymore. They were part of her story, proof of her strength, evidence of what she'd overcome. The shawl that had once been her armor now hung in their bedroom as a reminder of the journey that had brought them together. Marcus Chen was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for domestic violence, kidnapping, and multiple other charges. His business empire collapsed when other victims came forward, inspired by Sarah's courage to tell their own stories. The humanitarian awards and community recognition were quietly revoked. But for Sarah, the most important victory wasn't Marcus's punishment. It was the life she'd built for herself. She'd gone from being someone who existed at the mercy of another person's cruelty to being a woman who made her own choices, who contributed meaningfully to her community, who was loved and respected for exactly who she was. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked one evening, as they watched their infant daughter sleep peacefully in her crib. "Leaving everything behind? Coming here?" Sarah considered the question seriously, as she considered most things. "I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to leave. I regret the years I lost, the person I might have been if I'd never met Marcus. But coming here, finding this life, finding you, I don't regret that for a second." She stood at the window, looking out at the vast Montana landscape that had become her home, her sanctuary, her new beginning. Somewhere in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully under a star-filled sky. Elena was probably in the kitchen, preparing for tomorrow's breakfast and humming softly to herself. The ranch hands were settling in for the evening, secure in the knowledge that they were part of something bigger than themselves. "You know what I've learned?" Sarah said, turning back to her husband and daughter. "What's that?" "That sometimes the worst thing that happens to you leads directly to the best thing that happens to you. If Marcus hadn't been who he was, I never would have had to run. If I hadn't had to run, I never would have found my way here. And if I'd never come here, you'd never have met the most stubborn, protective rancher in Montana." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. The shadows were still there. They probably always would be. But they were balanced now by light, by hope, by the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. "I'd never have learned what it feels like to be truly safe," she said. "To be loved for who I am, instead of controlled for what I might become. To be someone's partner, instead of someone's possession." Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grass and carried the sound of cattle settling for the night. It was the sound of peace, of home, of a life built on foundations of mutual respect and genuine love. It was everything Sarah had never dared to hope for during those dark years, when survival was her only goal. "I love you, Jake Morrison," she whispered. "I love you too, Sarah Morrison," he replied. And in that moment, surrounded by the vast beauty of the Montana sky and the quiet contentment of their life together, Sarah finally understood what it meant to be truly free. The scars would always be there, reminders of a darker time, but they no longer defined her. She was no longer the woman who had arrived at Cedar Ranch 8 months ago, broken and afraid. She was Sarah Morrison now, rancher, wife, mother, survivor. She was home.